so excited to join you guys for this fireside chat with one of my very favorite thinkers and writers. And there's so many things that Ahmed does, I can't even begin to tell you, just general people. So Ahmed, welcome today.
Thank you so much, Jessica. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
I'm very excited to be able to feature Ahmed's work. And one of the nice things about this, we've done a few different things together, and usually I don't get as much of a chance to really brag on the work that he's done. And so I'm going to just take a minute, and I'm not even going to share all of his bio with you, but Ahmed Badr is an author, poet, and social entrepreneur. He is the founder of Narradio, which is an organization and online platform that elevates, that activates, supports, and highlights the creative expression of displaced young people through fellowships, workshops, publishing, and partnerships. So he started this when he was a teenager, when his career was really just beginning to take off at a time that most of us were trying to figure out what in the world we wanted to do. So he recently published a book, While the Earth Sleeps, We Travel, Stories, Poetry, and Art from Young Refugees Around the World. And I have a copy, and we're going to be talking about that in just a bit. In the pre-pandemic days, he was also doing all kinds of amazing projects, including a podcast called Unpacked, Refugee Baggage, that worked with Virginia, was it the Virginia Podcasting? What was it? The Virginia Public Media. So that was that was Resettled. Resettled was the podcast that was with Virginia Public Media. And he also was a storyteller behind Unpacked Refugee Baggage. So that was a multimedia installation. And it was an incredibly cool project. We got to look at this together, where they took suitcases, and as you open the suitcases up, it looked like the homes of former refugees. It was really amazing. In addition to all of these things, Ahmed is also showcased. He had 4 visual works at Educate, which is an exhibit featuring global emerging artists at Christie's in New York. So I have never had any art displayed at Christie's, which I think is incredibly cool. He's been featured in National Public Radio, Instagram, BuzzFeed, all kinds of other places. He is currently the 2021 National Geographic Young Explorer. He has presented before the UN more than 10 times, and he is one of 17 UN young leaders for the Sustainable Development Goals in the Office of the UN Secretary General's Envoy on Youth. And in case you didn't think that was enough, Ahmed, tell us about where you're headed next.
Oh my goodness. Really honored to be pursuing my master's in education leadership and entrepreneurship at Harvard this fall at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. So very excited to do that and start that journey soon.
One of my favorite things about Ahmed, in addition to all of the amazing success that he has, is he's one of those people who, when he is successful, all of the people around him are successful. And I think it's really fitting on this day of the Hello Neighbor Network to feature your work, Ahmed, because you're someone who is you have not just gone through some of the experiences that many refugees and displaced people have endured, but also you are yourself one of the advocates for people like that. And so I want to spend the time, we're just really going to chat. We're going to pretend like there's a fire, because we're at a fireside chat, which kind of cracks me up for April, but maybe some of you are in the north. I'm in Austin. It's definitely past fireside weather, but you and I are just going to take some time and talk a little bit. But I want to talk a little bit. I want to kind of begin thinking first of your role as someone who has both gone through this and who is advocating for people in displaced situations. You're kind of occupying a double space. And what has that been like for you?
That's a great question, Jessica. I think it's a privilege, I think, first and foremost, to be in the middle of those two spaces and to be able to kind of navigate them. My story and my understanding of my story started back in high school. And once I realized that I had a story to tell and the ability to tell it, that's what really started everything. That's what started Narratio. That's what started all of the different projects that have evolved over the years. So I think that in betweenness, having that experience, but also actively working to, create spaces where other displaced young people or other displaced people can, share their stories on their own terms. I think I couldn't do one without the other. So I think one space, they're intertwined in so many different ways. But I think at some point, I think over the last, 5-6 years, I realized that I didn't just want to share my story over and over again. I wanted to create or work towards this system where other stories can be shared and other stories can, exist beside my own and transcend my own. And so that's really the motivation behind the work. But that wouldn't have been possible without me first realizing the power of my own journey and my own story and then the power of being able to share that with folks around the world.
Yeah. One of the things that you and I have talked quite a bit about is the problematic phrase voice for the voiceless, which is something that comes up all the time. I don't know. Do you feel like you hear this term all the time?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So tell them a little bit about that time. Okay, so Ahmed and I got to do an incredibly cool event with Mandy Patinkin. Tell them a little bit about what happened.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Well, I think everything during that event was, focused around representation and refugee resettlement. And that word kept getting thrown around, voice for the voiceless. And one thing that really bothers me about this word, and I'm not the first person to take issue with this phrase, but is that it just takes away all of the agency over a person's individual story, and is at the heart of what we're trying to do at Narratio and over the overall projects. We just have to create spaces and actively invest in spaces where young people, displaced young people, can be able to share whatever it is they want to share with the world, whether that includes their displacement story or it doesn't. So that was one thing I, tried to get across during that session. And I think hopefully I did. Did I, Jessica?
I thought you did a great job. It was so amazing to me because, here's Mandy Patinkin, and I think it's okay to out Mandy as the person who was saying this. And so, it was so incredibly cool because I didn't expect Mandy Patinkin to even come to this amazing event. So we're just like hanging out in the screen room with Inigo Montoya. I didn't make any Princess Bride references, which I feel like everyone should give me points for. But he just kept saying things that I could tell they were kind of grating to all of us, right? Like they're grateful people, and they're just, they're all they need is just someone to give them a voice. And finally, I thought you did such an excellent job of saying, hey, to be clear, here's what this phrase looks like when you say it, and here's what I think I wish you would say better. And maybe he was like, okay, let me write this down. So he was like writing down all kinds of phrases. I think just like an incredible, it actually made me like an even bigger fan of his, to hear someone be corrected in real time in a very positive way, and for them to move immediately into better language. And I feel like that is such a great example for me. So often we find ourselves in situations where we are advocates trying to help others understand better how to talk about different groups of people, or I'm not, but others who do this work alongside me are themselves in a position of having to educate others. And it's such an awkward thing. So A, I think you handled it very deftly. But B, I feel like sometimes it's easier to identify all the things not to do. I would love for us to just take a minute and talk about your work in the book. So you didn't just write, these are not just your own poems, but they're poems of others. I want to spend some time as we talk in the next few minutes, really scaffolding out what are some positive things that we can do as we continue to elevate and amplify the voices of others. How did you do that in your poetry book?
Absolutely. So, there's so many different mediums represented. Obviously, poetry is at the heart of it all, but there are, photographs, there are drawings, artwork of different kinds. There are interviews, kind of long form interviews that are included. And, first there's the kind of a logistics angle to it. First, when, I traveled to Greece, I traveled to the Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago, working with Venezuelan refugees, and across the US with resettled refugees, but mostly in upstate New York and Syracuse. And there's something really powerful about doing a workshop and having specific workshop parameters around storytelling, but making different mediums available to those participating. It doesn't have to be, write this full poem, do this whole interview. You could pick among this kind of menu of things that, depending on what you're interested in. And the book features folks from different ages. So you'll see drawings from, 7, 8-year-olds to, poems and interviews with 25-year-olds and everything in between. So I think first and foremost, it's about just accessibility and making different storytelling mediums accessible, and informing that individual that it's up to them to define whatever it is that they want to share. And that's a key part of it. What oftentimes happens is that their story is kind of assumed, and then there's a specific expectation on what that story should be, focused on displacement, focused on these very kind of stereotypical things in many cases. But I wanted to flip that on its head and say, what do you want to share with the world? What do you want to, share with the world about your own journey and your own story and your hopes and your dreams and whatever it is that you want to accomplish and whatever it is that you look forward to. So I think that was a key piece of it. And I wanted it to be a collective piece. And it took a year to collect everything and then a year to put it together. And in putting it together, I struggled a little bit with trying to figure out what is my role here. You know, I have my own work. I was kind of the facilitator. I'm like the author. There are all these editor, curator, like all these different kind of roles that I wanted to make sure that I really just fully appreciated that responsibility and to do all of the pieces justice. And so ultimately I decided that my pieces, my poems in there, I wanted to have them kind of be a mediating force among all of the rest of them, not necessarily taking, you know, any attention away, but just kind of guiding the entire project forward. And so I hope I did that.
I think you did exactly that. So I'm going to ask you in just a second to read, but I just want to reflect back what I heard you say that is so brilliantly put. Giving people accessibility to a variety of mediums allows them to connect with what resonates the most with them, right? And one of the things that I come back to all the time, this is kind of an old adage in fiction writing, the difference between the situation and the story. And I think in narrative, it's been so fascinating to me as I teach narrative nonfiction, how often I just crib from fiction writing, right? Like we think of one as being imaginative and one as being like it has to be very factual. And sometimes in order to tell a compelling story, we need to pull from a lot of these craft pieces, right? But the difference between the situation and the story is something that novelists talk about all the time. So the situation is just the circumstances a person finds themselves in. The story is their own development as a person. And I feel like when we think about displaced people, those of us who have not necessarily been through it often come in with situational lenses as opposed to story lenses, right? Like and this is something that you and I have both found in our research. I find the stories always surprising, always delightful. People are really fascinating, right? And what they have to say is always really interesting. The situation is often the same. They've been through war, they fled, something happened. But when we always view it through this lens, we're missing, I think, the key parts of the story. Have you seen that in your experience?
Yeah, it's a beautiful way to put it. I think that contrast is so present between the story and the situation, and oftentimes they're kind of welded together, and they're said, well, the situation is the story, or the story always has to come out of the situation, which is just not the case. So at Narratio, we have a fellowship program, we have different workshops, we have the online publishing, and different partnerships where we're trying to complicate that relationship and say, well, we're trying to focus on the story. And if the situation finds its way into the story somehow, that's okay. But that individual has to decide that. And that individual has to decide how much of the situation to include, if anything at all. And it's up to them. So I think it's a really powerful and compelling way that you just put it, and that captures it perfectly.
And I know we have several people that are listening in as well who do this work in an advocacy sort of way. And often I know there are real limitations when you're grant writing or fundraising or trying to communicate people's stories to an audience that has the power in which to do something, even because they're going to be like underwriting your work. And I feel like one of the conversations you and I often have, I'm not sure I've ever thought about it quite in those terms, but I do think that's actually the thing that's the most compelling. When we center the voices of others and ask them what their stories are, that's the visceral connection that we often want. That's where that comes about. It's not because we're like, oh, look at this X, Y, and Z person who has gone through X, Y, and Z circumstances, but you, Ahmed, who has endured these things or who has felt these things or who grew in this way, connects with us in kind of a universal way, like human to human, right? I would love, and one of the things that there's so many things that I couldn't choose between your poems. I actually texted you this morning and was like, which of these do you want, right? And so I came back to what I think, I'm not sure it's my favorite, because how can you choose among works of art, but what I think is one of the most powerful pieces I've read in a long time, and that's your poem in this. And I want you to read it, and then I'm going to use that as kind of a basis to ask some other questions. So if you are looking in here, if you do have a copy of While the Earth Sleeps We Travel, will you tell us what page it's on, Ahmed?
It is on page 1, so really coming off
right there, right in the beginning.
Yeah. So page 1. This poem's called Frequently Asked Questions to an Iraqi Refugee. Is Osama bin Laden your cousin? No, but I have a cousin named Osama. You should get to know him. He loves Americans and their questions. You're from Iran, right? Or is it Iraq? I always get the two mixed up. Let me make it easier for you. Think weapons of mass destruction. Think George Bush. Think lies. Think war of terror. How did you survive the war? It must have been so hard for you and your family living under such a brutal dictator. Sometimes I forgot who was brutal. I forgot whose side Brutal was on. Brutal kept showing his face on the news, so I assumed that he had friends on both sides. You must have so many stories. Did you talk about any of them in your college essay? Oh my God, you would get in everywhere. Actually, you know how on the common application where you go to apply for college, you can attach files to your submission. I tried to upload some weapons of mass destruction, but for some reason, I just couldn't find any. Do you consider yourself Iraqi American? It's a label that I struggle with. Some days I wake up not knowing whether I'm the conquered or the conqueror. In 2003, a rifle was pointed at me. In 2008, we moved to America, and suddenly I was the one holding it. This time I was pointing the rifle at my old identity, asking it why it always mispronounced English, why it thought there was a difference between freedom and democracy, and asking it whether it thought that Arabic was written from right to left just to confuse the West, and asking it if the Mississippi ever heard of the Euphrates. In an interview with CBS News on September 12, 1996, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright was asked the following question. We have heard that 500,000 children have died in Iraq. Is the price worth it? She replied, we think the price is worth it. I recently found out that Secretary Albright teaches at Georgetown. I was rejected from Georgetown. My application essay was 500 words long, but I wanted to write 500,000. Growing up, Mama always told me, those who can't dance always say that the ground is crooked. Mama, it's hard to dance because the ground has 500,000 cracks whispering under my feet. They're telling me their names, ages, stories, and asking just how many cracks a metal is worth.
You see why I love this poem so much. It's so hard to segue out of that. And so I just want to tell you, that is one of the most powerful pieces I've heard in a long time, because you take the motif of what we were talking about, right? Like, how are people described? What are the stereotypes that people have in relation to you as a person? And you play with that and turn that into a critique of systems that have been brutal. And I want to talk a little bit about what are some things that you think, how can we keep this complexity? Like, one of the things that I love the most about this poem is it is complex. You are not landing on a side that says one is good, one is bad, one is right, one is wrong. You're wrestling with that in your identity. And I feel like it's such a perfect beginning to the book, because the book itself really, even in the pictures drawn by the youngest of the children, kind of dances around this complexity at all times, right? So how can those of us who are doing this work, I think we're in a particularly weird time right now in the United States. You and I've talked quite a bit about this. Obviously, since 2015, when the rhetoric really shifted against refugees, there's still long-term repercussions from what was happening in the early 2000s, up in the 90s, up until now. Biden still has not signed the presidential determination to allow refugees to come over. So many of us still feel like we're in a position of advocating for refugees in a way that allows resettlement to open up. And yet in doing that, sometimes we fall into these patterns of really simplistic language. How can we allow for complexity? Or what are some maybe things that you've seen in your work that allow this to be a better conversation than what we often have?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, we have to acknowledge that that complexity exists, right? Like, so oftentimes, and I think one of the questions in the poem around or one of the lines in the poem rather, about the kind of the Iraqi Americanness. For a long time, I thought Iraqi American was like an oxymoron. It didn't, like, I couldn't reconcile both, at the same time, because of the history, and the violence. And I mean, it speaks for itself. But over time, I realized that, it's okay to exist within that contradiction, because I am that contradiction. Like, I've spent most of my, life in the US now, 12 years in the US, 10 in the Middle East. And it's and it goes back to what you were saying earlier with that kind of in between, is that in between is such a powerful place to be. And I think as I got older, I became more and more comfortable with it, kind of embracing that contradiction. And grabbing what's best from each of those sides and making my own thing and doing this work and kind of trying to reach out to both sides in ways that are productive and ways that make sense. So I think first and foremost, that complexity needs to be acknowledged before it can be embraced, and recognizing that like contradictions are okay and that we need to work through them. We might not be able to work through them and have a resolution, but that process of working through them is incredibly productive. And there's a self-awareness that comes out of it that I think is really incredibly powerful. So I think we have to acknowledge it, we have to embrace it, and embrace that when we come out on the other side, we may have more questions than answers.
Yes, I think, one of the things I could talk a lot about is just being a person who has social skills is going to take us far in this, and not always having to answer all of these questions. And I think your work, not just in this book, but also in other places, really speaks to, I think you're someone I would describe as having a profound commitment to contradiction and complexity. And it is a very difficult commitment to maintain sometimes. I think we are all in a world that, we live in a world that expects us to put profound thoughts into 280 characters or stuff that, and to exhibit gratefulness or to exhibit an expected story. And I think you were really just at the beginning of a lifetime of work that is embracing these complications, and that's allowing so many others to really benefit from the, your openness to whatever story it is that they have, right? And I think that seems incredibly important to me. I want to say, we don't have this is such a short thing. We could ask questions of Ahmed all day. If you have any questions, feel free to put them really quick in the Q&A at the bottom, and we may have time to get to one or two. But I really wanted to ask you, what advice do you have for those of us who are doing this work? How can we, what are some, even some nuts and bolts kinds of things? How can we continue to, what are some positive ways that we can have these possibly contradictory, complicated conversations that center people without it feeling tokenistic? Sometimes it really does, where we're like, okay, this is our token person who is now going to do this work. And sometimes that puts former refugees or displaced people in an awkward position of having to educate those of us in wealthier circumstances about their own lives. What can we do? What are some things that you've seen that work well?
Yeah, I think a profound sense of self-awareness always goes a long way with anything in life.
Yeah.
I think in this case, it applies as well. So I think in that specific case with kind of avoiding tokenistic things, I think it all comes down to first, what goals you are, if there's a specific event that you're putting on, what goals are there and what parameters have you set for not just representation, but representation as defined by those folks that you are bringing in to be the representatives. That's a key difference, where it's not just let's invite this person and then they'll say what they want to say, but actually checking in with that person and say, okay, well, this is the context of what this event is. This is what we're trying to kind of get across or achieve. Does that make sense for you and your goals? That's a very simple thing, but I think it goes a long way. And so I think but that is all, again, that's all informed by this profound self-awareness of your own privilege, your own kind of biases and assumptions. But again, being very, very forward about them and again, inviting that. And I talk a lot about, this work always being an invitation. And I think that's it applies here as well. Like it's thinking of this work and thinking of whether it's speaking engagements or projects where displacing people or displaced folks are involved. Like it's all about it being an invitation, and then you alongside that person shaping what that invitation looks like and making sure that the other person is doing things on their own terms as defined by them.
I love that. And I think that's such a great way to be thinking about this, that it's not just we're inviting people because we want to make sure that we have someone else who's a former refugee. It's, are you someone who would really like to do this work? How can we facilitate that for you and give you opportunities to share a story that's really important? I feel like you have had people that have invited you into these spaces. I know you've had people that have not done it, but again, part of, I mean, that have done it in a kind of awkward way too. But I feel like you've had some really generous people who have invited you in and have just been blown away by who you are as a person and by the work that you're doing. And I think so often we're missing the opportunity perhaps to hear from others who, I love what you were saying, like, what would your goal be if you were able to talk to so many people? The question that I've started asking, because it's the thing that came up most often, and I only learned it kind of the hard way because people kept answering it before I even asked it, is what would you tell Americans if you had the chance to speak to a large audience? And man, the answers to that are so very different from what I think that they might be, right? I love that. We have a quick question. What advice, Ahmed, do you give newly resettled youth who really struggle with that loss of identity during the resettlement process in America? That's a really good one.
That's a great question. Yeah, I think just, be prepared for it to be a ride. It's not and wherever possible, try to, whether it's, for me, it was through writing, to kind of preserve the things that will start to slip away, whether those are memories, whether those are, whether it's language skill. The language skills you could always get back later on, but those memories that are so vivid when you first arrive, those always start to slip away. And I remember in high school actively spending like 2 years just writing down every memory I wanted to make sure I remembered, and then just having that in one place. So logistically, that's always helpful, just to have it be in place, but also recognize that the process that is about to begin is one of evolution and one of negotiation between these different identities. And so I think, again, it goes back to what we're talking about in terms of the complexity and learning to embrace it. I think recognizing that, there's a lot ahead, and that, you can hold on to the foundational pieces that make you who you are, and move forward with the understanding that, you can be multiple things at once, and you can kind of grab the best of this, grab the best of that, and chart your own way.
I love that idea of the best of this and the best of that. I think that that's it's a difficult thing to do. And yet I think it's something that you have just done incredibly well. And I say this not just as someone who is an admirer of your work and is very excited about, obviously about this book, but about the many books that I think we're going to see from you in your very long career ahead, but also just as a person. I think one of the things that is the hardest as a nonfiction writer is that doing the internal work in order to tell stories of others is so difficult and is something that we often ignore. And I think you have done that internal work in a way that puts to shame people 3 times your age. And so I'm really always blown away by the work that you've done. I haven't told Ahmed this, but I would like to do something. I'm going to send a quick link to everyone, see if this will work. After this, I have 2 copies of this, I realized, and I would love to do a little giveaway on my Instagram. So I'm going to let you guys use these links if you want to get to my Instagram or to Ahmed's Instagram, and I'll put some details up there. But if you want to go see that, I would love to send a copy of this book to someone who's in the United States. So go to my Instagram in about 20 minutes when I've had time to type this up, and I'll have a quick little giveaway and let one lucky winner get a chance to experience these poems and artwork and just this entire extraordinary and very rich collection. If you are not able to get this, I highly suggest buying this. And I know that we have the link up in the chat. This is one of my favorite books that I've read in a very long time. And so I'm really excited that not only that we got a chance to talk, but that this is something that can be used for groups around the country as they continue to do this kind of extraordinary and very complicated work. So Ahmed, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for your generosity and your thoughtfulness and your kindness. It's an honor to know you, and it's an even bigger honor to have shared this space with you. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And we're very excited that the Hello Neighbor Network invited us to do this. And I just want to make sure that you guys stick around for the next session that's coming up at 2:30. I think it's, I lost my page, a fireside chat, a woman's place. So this is going to be really exciting. Obviously, this is something that we really care about. So coming up in just 1 minute, make sure you stick around for a woman's place. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.